There, in front of Thomas, was a room which had been transformed into a bedroom just for him. "This were our room, young'un, but while you're here it's yours," said his grandfather, grinning under a thick grey beard. They had removed all their personal belongings and some of their furniture. In its place they had installed some old pine fittings, a bedside cabinet, a wardrobe with a curtain front, a single bed with a carved pine headboard, a desk and a chair, and in one corner of the room, just below the sloping beams of the cottage, there was an old chest. Thomas looked at it. He was sure he'd seen one like it in an old pirate film. "Is it a real pirate's chest?" said Thomas, with excitement. His grandfather, not wanting to tell a lie nor take away some of the excitement, smiled and nodded. The room had a small window with a shutter. Placed in front of it was a table and something covered with an old cotton cloth. Thomas looked at the strange shape, then his grandfather. "Go on, young'un, take the sheet off then," said his grandfather. Thomas walked over to the table and pulled off the sheet. There on a tripod stood a large, old, leather-covered telescope, but best of all, the view from the window was right across the harbour. In fact, the side of the cottage was part of the harbour boundary. If Thomas had leant out the window and dropped a penny, it would have fallen into the salty seawater. "Is it for me, grandfather?" "Yes, I've had it for some years now, but wanted to find a good home for it, and I reckon it has one now." Thomas was overwhelmed, but then he realised where he was. "But this was your room, grandfather, yours and grandmother's," said Thomas. "Let's say we needed a change of scenery," said his grandfather, chuckling as he patted Thomas on the head. "We thought you'd like it." Thomas threw his arms round the old man and said thank you. "Hold on, I think you'd have to say some of that for your gran. It were her idea." Thomas ran downstairs and almost jumped into his gran's arms. "Thank you, Gran, it's fab," exclaimed Thomas. "I think the young'un likes it," said his grandfather as he appeared at the bottom of the stairs. As the sun gradually began to disappear over the horizon and dusk fell all round the harbour, the old cast-iron weather-beaten lamps glowed with their lights reflecting on the shimmering water. Along the streets the lamps were attached to walls and the corners of houses, but provided limited light at the passageways due to the number of twists and turns in the lanes. Thomas was in his room trying to use his telescope. It took him a few minutes to work it out, as he'd only ever used one once before, and that was when he was very young, and that one needed a coin to operate it. This required some manual focusing. "Tom, your dinner's ready," called his gran from the bottom of the stairs. He was reluctant to leave his new toy, because he'd just mastered how to focus it, but he had agreed to be good and listen to his grandparents. After all, they'd given up their room for him, so he headed downstairs. Thomas sat at the table with his grandfather to the left of him and was trying to crane his neck to look out of the window across the harbour when his gran placed 2 plates of steaming fish pie in front of them both. She returned to the kitchen to collect hers and join him at the tiny wooden table. "What are you looking at, Tom?" his gran asked. "I was just looking at the lights on the water and wondering why it's quiet." "What do you mean quiet?" asked his grandfather. "Where have all the seagulls gone? There's no noise now." "They've all had their dinner and gone to bed now, so if you don't eat your dinner, it'll be your bedtime soon," added his gran. Everything in the cottage was on a small scale, which gave a very cosy and quaint feeling about the place. Sitting at the table with his grandparents, he looked around the room at the decoration. It was as though time had passed them by and they were in a world of their own. The walls were adorned with pictures and objects connected to the sea. On one wall was a trawler's net with shells, driftwood and an old plastic fish entwined in it. Above the fireplace was a whaling harpoon. Thomas eagerly ate his dinner and chatted about how he remembered some of the things in the cottage, but not others. There was a strange sensation on his legs which made him shiver. Knowing from Thomas' reaction what he'd just experienced, his grandfather looked at his wife and winked. "I reckon the young'un were hungry after his long journey," he said, changing the subject. "I think so," agreed his gran as she gave a sideways glance at Thomas, who was too engrossed in trying to work out what had happened to him to hear the comments. He leant back in his chair and looked under the table. Sitting at his feet, hoping that a morsel of fish pie might fall onto the floor, was a large black and white cat. He nearly fell off his chair with shock. "Gran, there's a cat in here," he exclaimed. "Oh, it's only Bosun," she said. "I didn't know you had a cat." "Neither did we until a week ago," said his grandfather, scooping up a forkful of fish pie. "He belonged to an old lady I knew, but she passed away 3 weeks ago and her cat was on its own. It was going to be put down. I couldn't let it happen. He's such a lovely natured cat. So we adopted him," explained his gran. "I think he adopted us, young, and the real story is that after the old lady died, the cat disappeared for several days. Then he turned up on our doorstep. Your gran didn't have the heart to turn him away, so here he's stayed ever since. She's made him a bed in the kitchen near the cooker. He has his meals here, so I think he's here to stay now. In fact, at this rate of progress, he'll be upstairs and I'll be sleeping on the floor next to the cooker," and his grandfather glancing across at his wife, laughing. "Can I pick him up, Grandma?" "Not until you've finished your dinner." "Why is he called Bosun?" "Because I used to know the bosun of a ship. Always made himself at home when he ever was invited out for tea. Often he would go out and not go home that night, choosing to sleep on the floor or settee, if it were available, until the next day," said his grandfather. Not seeming to get any tidbits from the table, Bosun decided to take himself off in search of another source of food, but not before he consumed a full dish full of cat food from the kitchen. After dinner, Thomas helped his gran wash up, while his grandfather sat back in his favourite armchair and looked out of the window across the harbour. "Gran," said Thomas, "does Grandpa miss the sea?" "Yes, I think he does, but I don't think he misses it so much in the winter and the cold weather when he was tossed about on the high rolling waves of the winter storms. He had a hard life, though he won't admit it." "Was he away a long time at sea?" "Sometimes he'd be away from home for up to 2 weeks. In the old days, the boats weren't as highfalutin as they are now. They travelled much slower." "Didn't you get fed up on your own?" "No, we were a real community, Len. All the wives would help each other, and we'd have tea and knit together in the mission hall. We knew our men would be working hard to support us." A slight tear appeared in her eyes. She thought about the old days and remembered friends who had long passed on. Thomas noticed that she was getting upset. He put his arm around her and said, "Come on, Gran, you've got me now." She smiled and held him tightly. After all the dishes had been cleared away, the three of them sat in front of the log fire that was smouldering away in the hearth. Though it was summer, the little stone cottages tended to strike cold in the evening due to the proximity to the water, and the fire gave just enough heat to make the atmosphere comfortable. "Grandfather, tell me one of your stories, will you? The one about the big octopus getting on the boat." Even though the tale seemed to be so far-fetched to be true, Thomas just loved listening to his grandfather's stories in his soft but gruff voice. He always put so much emotion in his stories. Sometimes Thomas could almost believe he was there with him. "It were a cold wintry night," he began, "and we could hear the bells of the marker boys warning us fishermen of the sandbanks and the hidden rocks under the water. Their dull clanging tones seemed to be answering each other as they swayed about in the swell of the sea." He continued the story as Thomas sat fixated to his every word. His gran took out her knitting and sat back in a rocking chair, shaking her head and smiling as the tale unfolded. At the point where his grandfather started to describe the octopus launching itself towards the ship's deck, his grandmother mouthed the words in unison, since she heard the story so many times before. "It was the size of 3 men and was lashing its tentacles, trying to tip the boat over," she muttered. She paused for a moment and looked up at her husband as he uttered the words. "It was the size of 4 men, he said." "This animal seems to be getting bigger every time he tells it. Certainly be bigger than Betsy," she murmured to herself. As the night drew on, Thomas's grandfather did talk about his days at sea and the life he led. The old clock on the mantelpiece struck 10 times to announce it was getting late. His gran put knitting down on the chair and went to get them a nice cup of cocoa ready for bedtime. "I think we all need to go and settle down after we've had a drink. All this excitement on the high seas makes me tired," she said as she came in with a tray and 3 mugs balanced on it. Thomas could have stayed listening to the stories all night, but didn't complain. He sipped his drink, said goodnight to his grandparents and made his way up the twisty staircase to bed. "Don't forget to clean your teeth, young'un, or you won't have no teeth to chew your gran's cooking with," shouted his grandfather. His wife slapped him on the shoulder playfully and took the cups into the kitchen. They put the lights out and headed for their back bedroom. "It's nice having some of your life around here, isn't it?" said Thomas's gran. "Ah, it is," replied his grandfather as he closed the little wooden bedroom door. The hooting of a ship's horn woke Thomas up. He knew immediately what it was and rushed to the shuttered window to look across the harbour, just in time to see a big fishing vessel disappearing in the early morning mist that enveloped the quayside. This was how he had always imagined his grandfather through the port when he used to go fishing. As he stood in his pyjamas staring out the window, he could just make out a shadowy figure sitting on a capstan on the far side of the harbour. He squinted for a minute, trying to see what the figure was doing. Then he remembered he was standing by a telescope. Perhaps he could see better with that. He twisted the small metal eyepiece ring until the image came into focus. It was his grandfather. He was sitting wiping a tear from his eye. He stood up and walked away, heading towards home. Thomas got up, dressed, and went downstairs into the warm living room. After a while his grandfather came in. "Morning, Grandpa," said Thomas. "Where have you been?" "Morning, young'un. I went to see the fleet off. They've gone fishing now." "Will they be long?" "Maybe about a week. The fish stocks are getting further away, so they have to sail further and further every trip to get a good catch." "Now you two," said his grandma as she came in from the kitchen with a teapot and a sugar bowl. "Sit down at the table, both of you, and I'll bring in your breakfast." "I'll just take my coat off and wash my hands, pet," said his grandfather. With that he hung his coat upon the hook near the door and went upstairs to wash his hands. "Gran, I saw Grandpa on the quayside through the telescope this morning. I think he was crying. Why?" "Oh, Thomas, he often does that. He always gets up early when the fleet are leaving. I think he misses his boat and the sea. This has been his whole life, man and boy. Now he's retired, sometimes he feels lost." His grandfather came down the stairs and his grandma put her finger to her lips to indicate he shouldn't talk about their little chat. Thomas winked to show that he understood. They all sat down to a bowl of porridge, followed by egg on toast and a cup of tea. "Thomas, I'm going to work in the old seaman's mission today. I thought you'd like to come with me. You'll need to put a jumper on. It can be cool even in the summer," said his grandma. Though he had no idea what she meant, he agreed and went upstairs to get ready. Thomas's grandma worked on a stall in the old mission hall. It had been converted into a crude form of craft market with stalls selling items made by the locals. This is where she and her friends sold their knitting. Chunky jumpers, scarves, cardigans, in fact most knitted items adorned their stall. Each trader paid a small amount to rent the space, and 5% of any sales went to the Seamen's Mission. It did seem odd, since this was a charity which helped support an old retired fisherman of the town, one of which was her husband. Thomas's grandfather was a very proud man, and did not easily accept charity, but his wife had persuaded him it was her knitting that was paying for their welfare. Thomas and his gran walked down the old cobbled streets towards the mission hall. Nearly every passer-by seemed to know her. With various exchanges about the weather, who Thomas was, and the welfare of her family, these seemed to be the main topics of interest for the day. They arrived at the heavy, dark-stained oak door, which was half ajar. Inside it was like an Aladdin's cave of crafts and oddments. From the woolen crafts of his grand stall, to carved animals, glass dishes and sculptures, to books, door handles, greetings cards and furniture, even garden plants, all had their own place. Thomas didn't know where to look first. The main shoppers in the Emporium were likely to be day trippers, so it was important that stallholders opened early and stayed open late to make as much money as they could during the tourist season. Thomas was introduced to each stallholder, was glad to see a new helper, and he was invited to work alongside any of them during the day. It was soon lunchtime, and his gran told Thomas to stay at the hall and help a friend look after the stall while she went to get their dinner. About 20 minutes later, she came back to the stand with a basket. Putting the tea cloth back, she revealed 3 pasties, one for Thomas, one for her, and one for a friend. She then proceeded to open a flask and pour each of them a cup of steaming hot tea. Thomas ate his pasty with great enthusiasm as he loved his grandmother's homemade cooking. All afternoon he was busy moving between the stalls, looking very important as the tourists made their purchases. He was really enjoying his day and was even able to make a sale of his own. By 5 o'clock the coach parties of tourists had dwindled away, and the only customers who were browsing the array of goods were the ones staying in the little fishing village. "Gran, can I go outside for a bit? I won't go away," asked Thomas. The other stallholders agreed it was quite a safe village and he would be fine. She agreed, and he went out for the late afternoon sunshine. He had to squint a bit, since his eyes became accustomed to the dimly lit world of the craft market. He sat on the wall and swung his legs in his usual style. Suddenly, he sensed he was being watched. He turned slowly and came face to face with something he never expected to see.